Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. And tonight I'm going to be doing a video which is in the theme of the coming season, the coming few weeks, which is the Christmas season. I'll be talking about the reason for this season. No, not rampant consumerism, rather the celebration of the birth of Jesus, mixed in with a lot of paganism and earlier pagan customs, but primarily in this day and age, it's to do with the advent of the Christ. So what I wanted to do tonight is look at the Christmas story as it's handed down to us in the canonical Gospels, and really look at how truthful that story is, or how not truthful that is, and whether or not the underlying premise of that story holds any sort of a truth to do with the coming of the Christ into the world, and ultimately the fulfilment of a number of Old Testament prophecies to that effect. And basically, you know, not to spoil too much, but my premise for this video is going to be that the writers of the canonical Gospels, particularly Matthew and Luke, were a little bit like a person at a party who has a really good joke with a really good punchline that's really funny, but they're just terrible at the delivery of that joke. And so when they tell the joke, nobody laughs, and maybe the other people at the party kindly tell them to leave. But so the metaphor here is, of course, that the writers of the Gospels, particularly Matthew and Luke, had an incredible story at their disposal that was symbolically very powerful, rooted in real prophecy and real history. But the way that they communicated that was really forced and contrived, and took away from the underlying message, and was full of contradictions. So that's the thing that I want to kind of unpick tonight. So where does the story of the Nativity come from? Where does the Christmas story come from? It doesn't actually come from the earliest writings of the church, of the early church. It's not to be found in the writings of St. Paul, and it's not to be found in the Gospel of Mark, which is by most people agreed to be the very earliest written account of the story of Jesus. The Advent part of the story of Jesus comes later, appears to be a later addition, which comes down to us in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And what Matthew and Luke do, each in their own different way, is they go to great pains to explain specific details about the early life of Jesus, and really labour that part of the story and different elements of that part of the story. And there's a specific reason why they do that. And that is that both Matthew and Luke, the whole point of that part of their narrative in their Gospels is to try and demonstrate that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies to do with the birth of the Messiah. There's just one problem. It doesn't appear as though Matthew and Luke were giving an entirely factual account of what happened in the early life of Christ. They were making up a story in order to illustrate their point, because they didn't really know what happened. So they tried to reconstruct it as best they could, independently of one another, and they both came up with different stories which contradict each other, which is never a good sign. But as with the example of the person who badly delivers a good joke, just because somebody does a bad job of explaining a premise doesn't disprove the premise. So I want to go through each of the biblical prophecies from the Old Testament that the coming Messiah was meant to fulfill in Jewish tradition, and see how Matthew and Luke tried to prove that in their text, and look at what Matthew and Luke were wrong about, and if there's anything which does prove that perhaps that prophecy was fulfilled in the person of Jesus. There are, of course, other prophecies of the Messiah throughout the Old Testament. This video only deals with those prophecies which are to do with the birth of the Messiah. And this video will only cover prophecies which the Jewish tradition agrees are actually prophecies. We're not going to be looking at Psalms or anything else from Scripture which probably never was intended as a prophecy but was taken as such by the Christians later on. It's just going to be the basics. So what was the first criteria of this coming Messiah according to the Old Testament? Well, first, the Messiah would have to be a descendant of Abraham, his son Isaac, and his son Jacob. In Genesis chapter 18, verse 18, God promises Abraham that from him a great nation would be born, and through that nation the whole world would be blessed, which is interpreted as being a reference to the fact that the Messiah would emerge from that nation and bring blessing to the world in fulfilling their mission. And then later on in Genesis it becomes apparent that that promise passed down from Abraham was passed to Isaac and then to Jacob. And Numbers 24:17 then gives us the prophecy that a star shall come out of Jacob and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, which is a prophecy that one of Jacob's descendants, who would ultimately be a king, would fulfill this prophecy of the Messiah. And since they're a king, they must also come from the line of kings of the Israelites, which is of course the line of David. And this is the next prophecy that must be fulfilled by the Messiah. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, God tells King David through Nathan that one of David's descendants would be raised up as the messianic king. Another prophecy that alludes to the Messiah coming from the Davidic kingly line is in Isaiah 11 chapter 1, which says that from the stump of Jesse will come a shoot, and a branch from that root would emerge. Basically, from the family tree of Jesse, who was from the Israelite tribe of Judah and one of King David's direct ancestors, that from that line would come the messianic king. And David emerged as the promised king, and then one of David's descendants would be this future Messiah. And Genesis 49 chapter 10 reads that the scepter shall not depart from the tribe of Judah. So all of this is setting up that there needs to be a particular family line that the Messiah comes from. And it is for this reason that both Matthew and Luke include very detailed genealogies at the beginning of both of their Gospels, drawing a line from at least Abraham, if not Adam, all the way down to Jesus, through David, of course, and Isaac and Jacob. Matthew is content just to go back to Abraham to demonstrate his point. Luke has to go all the way back to Adam. But one thing that is readily apparent when you put these two genealogies next to each other is that they actually contradict one another in many points. And Matthew traces Jesus' descent from David via David's son, King Solomon, while Luke traces that descent via David's other son, Nathan, the prophet. And nor can these two contradicting genealogies be reconciled by the fact that maybe one of them was Mary's genealogy, because, of course, in Matthew and Luke, they both say that they are tracing the descent down to Joseph, Jesus' father, or adopted father, if you believe in the story of the virgin birth. Although it does appear that Mary may have been a cousin of Joseph, also descended from this same line. But it appears that the genealogies in Matthew and Luke are very contrived. There's generations missing. There's symbolic numbers of generations between different figures, which suggests some symbolic aspect to the narrative rather than a literal one. All of this points to the genealogies from David down to Jesus, from Abraham down to Jesus through Joseph being very contrived and made up, in fact, in the latter part, which isn't confirmed by the Old Testament genealogies. So what does this mean exactly? Does it mean that we have no way of proving that Jesus was a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and ultimately King David? Well, no, that's not entirely true, and it goes without saying, really, that Jesus fulfills those first parts of the prophecy. As a Jewish man, he must have indeed been a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and indeed from the tribe of Judah. As for the Davidic descent argument, well, we don't really have any reliable pedigree chart which can draw a direct link from Jesus to David, but breakthroughs in statistical research may in fact prove Jesus' descent from David. And I'll explain why. There was recent research done which demonstrated that any given person whose ancestors have lived in the same place for 1,000 years is descended from every person who lived 1,000 years before them in that same region. Or there's about an 80% chance to factor in the fact that not all people who lived 1,000 years before left living descendants. But we know that King David did leave living descendants because well into medieval times in Babylon there were still exilarchs alive who traced their lineage back to the Davidic kingly line. So there certainly would have been living descendants of David in Jesus' own time. And if you look at historically when King David was supposed to have lived, it was about 1,000 years before Jesus. So if Jesus was a historical person and David was a historical person, then Jesus almost certainly was a descendant of David, statistically speaking, as indeed was every person living in Judea or Galilee at the time. So perhaps Jesus in fact did fulfill those prophecies, and the gospel writers just explained it very badly. The next prophecy that the Messiah must fulfill is the prophecy in Micah chapter 5 verse 2, which says that the Messiah must be of Bethlehem. The early gospel writers Matthew and Luke interpreted this as meaning that the Messiah must be born in the town of Bethlehem. And indeed, in the Gospel of John chapter 7 verse 42, the crowd are challenging Jesus, saying, is it not written that the Messiah must be born in Bethlehem? Implying that there was a common understanding among the people at the time that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, and that Jesus didn't fulfill that prophecy because he wasn't born in Bethlehem. We don't really know from other gospel accounts where Jesus was supposed to be born. We know that he was from Nazareth. That's not to say that he was born there. But clearly Matthew and Luke felt the need to establish that Jesus was born in Bethlehem to fulfill this messianic prophecy. But once again, the two accounts contradict each other. In the Gospel of Matthew, we're given an account where Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem, and that's where Jesus is born, but then they're forced to flee to Egypt when Herod is trying to unalive the innocents, and then later on, some years later, return and eventually settle in Nazareth once King Herod has left this earth, has passed away, which is said to have happened about 4 BCE. In Luke, however, Mary and Joseph travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem for the census of Quirinius, which happened 10 years after the death of Herod in 6 CE, which creates our first contradiction in the narratives. And the next contradiction is that the censuses that were carried out by the Roman Empire didn't require you to return to the place of your ancestors. They were held in the town in which you lived. So the narrative just makes no sense. And again, it seems like a contrivance to place Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. But ironically enough, even though all of this effort was made by Matthew and Luke to fabricate an account placing Jesus in Bethlehem for his birth, that's not even the correct interpretation of that particular messianic prophecy. To say that the Messiah is of Bethlehem is simply to say that since Bethlehem was the town of David, the Messiah would be a descendant of David. It's another prophecy about the messianic bloodline of David, which we've already established may well have been fulfilled by Jesus. So that supersedes the need for the Nativity to occur in Bethlehem in the first place. What about the connection with Nazareth? Well, Matthew 2:23 says that Jesus coming from Nazareth was the fulfillment of a prophecy in the Old Testament. It's not clear which prophecy that is, but it appears that this is also based on a misinterpretation of something. It's not even agreed whether the town of Nazareth even existed in Jesus' own time, or if it was a very significant settlement if it did exist. But there's another meaning behind the term Nazarene, which has been interpreted as somebody who is from the town of Nazareth. It could indeed be referring to the root of that word stemming from the Hebrew for branch. Yet another reference to the fact that the Messiah would be the root of Jesse, as explained previously in this video. The next prophecy that the birth of the Messiah must fulfill is Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, which says that the Messiah, the promised son, will be named Emmanuel. And this is supposedly fulfilled in the Gospel of Matthew when the angel tells Joseph that you must call this child Emmanuel. Again, this is a forced part of the narrative to establish that something happened, which is based on an interpretation of prophecy that's too literal. The word Emmanuel means God is with us. Really, what the verse in Isaiah is trying to say in poetic language is that the child will be called Emmanuel because the coming of this child will represent the unfolding of the presence of God in people's lives in some way that it didn't happen before. Not that the child would literally be called Emmanuel by somebody. I mean, come on. So again, if we look at the last 2,000 years of history, flawed and full of atrocities though it may be, and hypocrisy though it may be, in the final analysis, you know, that child did inaugurate a new age of bringing people to a better understanding of their relationship with God and how that should determine how they behave in the world. So we can say that that prophecy was fulfilled, but again, not because of the way that the writers of Matthew and Luke tried to really force that point in their telling of the Nativity story. The next prophecy that the Messiah must fulfill comes from Psalm chapter 2 verses 1 to 12, which is that he will be called the Son of God. This promised king would be regarded as God's son, and he would regard God as his father. And the canonical gospel writers appear to have taken this verse once again in a way that it was never intended to be taken. They draw upon the Hellenistic and Greco-Roman pagan mythologies that they were familiar with and try and apply that to the Jewish worldview to say, oh, this is just like Hercules being the son of Zeus, or this is just like Romulus and Remus being the sons of Ares. A god came down and did the deed with a human woman and conceived a child who was the son of a god, who would rise to greatness because they were divinity born in the world of the flesh, as in like an incarnation of godliness. And, you know, They were the Son of God in the way that Caesar Augustus tried to portray himself as the Son of God and used that title to describe himself in around the same time that Christianity was beginning to form. And so we have this whole story about the conception of Jesus through Mary, through God. But does this have any precedent in earlier Jewish practices or beliefs or expectations about the Messiah? The answer is no. We can have the argument about whether at an earlier point in the evolution of the Judaic religion, whether God could take a physical form, and there's been some good scholarship on this in recent times, but certainly by the time of Jesus, the understanding was that God was incorporeal and certainly could not father children in the way that the pagan gods were said to have done. And in fact, the Son of God in this instance has a very different meaning, in the sense of a human being becoming the adopted Son of God. That is to say, giving their life to God, having some special mission appointed to them by God, and it was more often than not used to refer to a messianic king who was anointed for this purpose. Another reference to the Messiah, as has been previously laid out in this video. And this brings me to the last prophecy I'll cover tonight, which again comes to us from Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, which is supposedly the prophecy that says that the Messiah must be born of a virgin. This is, again, a big misinterpretation. So we have the narrative which says that Jesus is supposed to be conceived of a mortal and a god, like the Greek gods, and fed into this narrative is the extra layer of Mary being a virgin when it happened, to make it extra miraculous. And the misinterpretation here seems to come from a particular Hebrew word. The Hebrew word in question is alma, which more precisely is translated to a young woman of childbearing age, not a virgin specifically, but the early church writers, in their ignorance, seem to have interpreted as meaning, oh, that must be a virgin. And so we have a prophecy which was initially just saying the Messiah would be born of a young woman, which undoubtedly Jesus was, to putting this extra qualification on that it had to be a virgin birth. But there might be another reason for saying that Jesus' parentage was divine. It could be that Jesus' human parentage was in fact open to dispute, and perhaps there were rumors that he could have been an illegitimate child. There has been some scholarship, although marginal, that this may have been the case. One thing presented as quite suspect is Mark chapter 6 verse 3, remembering again that Mark is the earliest gospel account, referring to Jesus as the son of Mary. Now this is unusual because a male child in those days would be referred to as the son of their father, and to say that they were the son of their mother was almost to say that there was something disgraceful about the way they were born, or illegitimate about the way that they were born. So perhaps the reason for such an outlandish story as I was a virgin and I remain one because I was entered into by God and conceived miraculously that way was a way of trying to explain away this disgraceful rumor about Jesus' past, or what would be considered disgraceful in those days, which obviously couldn't be allowed to stand if this person was supposed to be the righteous king that was promised in the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. But there's really nothing to prove this rumor about the supposed illegitimacy of Jesus' birth. So, all things considered, if you look at the proper interpretation of these particular prophecies, you could say that Jesus does indeed fulfill the prophecies about the Messiah concerning the birth of the Messiah. But as you can see from this video, Matthew and Luke have made a right mess of explaining how the actual events of Jesus' life match up with the prophecies. And the latest innovation of church leaders to make this story even more incredulous seeming is the concept of the inerrancy of Scripture, which is not something inherent in Scripture itself. It's something which came about from the evangelical churches in modern times, the 19th or 20th century. But this whole idea of the inerrancy of Scripture, it's full of holes. As we've seen, there's contradictions between different scriptures about key events. The Deuteronomists of the Old Testament period didn't consider the scriptures so inerrant that it prevented them from making edits to the first 5 books of the Bible. And of course, who's to say what Scripture is? Just because the Council of Nicaea happened, it doesn't mean that there's a universally agreed on list of books which are scriptural. So this idea of biblical inerrancy is just full of holes. If we can just agree that God is a mystery and that humans can do a pretty good job of explaining it in inspired texts such as the Gospels, but stuff up at times because they're human, we've got much more solid ground to stand on when we begin to have discussions about the nature of divinity, who Jesus was, and so forth, without wandering into the realm of the ridiculous. And so that's what I've tried to do with this video, and I think that I've done a pretty faithful job of looking at the prophecies objectively and also looking at the truth or falsehood of the various Gospels objectively. So those are my conclusions, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Perhaps it's given you some food for thought in this coming time of Christmas. But thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video, subscribe to this channel to support my work. Please also subscribe to my Odyssey account, and I will see you next time.